In the hush of morning, before the wind had fully risen and the dust of the west had begun its restless dance, the prairie lay still as a sleeping child. The sun was not yet bold enough to spill its full gold across the land, only touching gently the tops of tall grass and the soft buds of wildflowers that swayed like shy maidens in their Sunday best. Among them, a figure moved with care, not so much walking as threading herself through the world. Lily Bell Franklin was hardly taller than the stalk she passed, her bonnet tilted just enough to catch the light that dappled through it. To the eyes of strangers, she might have seemed misplaced in the wide, untamed country, a girl built like a whisper in a land that demanded thunder. But she moved like one born of this soil, with a rhythm that matched the breath of it. She did not hurry. She never had. The town of Harmony Ridge sat like a faded photograph on the edge of a long horizon, buildings sun-bleached and leaning a little from the years. Lily had known every board and nail since childhood, having arrived at age 9 with nothing but a patched-up dress and the ghost of her mother's lullabies still clinging to her. Her aunt, Mirabelle Franklin, had taken her in, a stern widow who ran the millinery with the precision of a clockmaker and loved Lily in the hard, roundabout way some women did, through discipline and the quiet placing of extra bread on a dinner plate. Though others never said it directly, Lily knew what they thought. Too small. Too fragile. She could ride but never reach the saddle without a crate. Could sew but needed a cushion beneath her to work the pedal. Her laughter, when it came, was soft and caught easily in the wind. But her spirit was not weak. It was simply quiet, the way tree roots are quiet, growing steadily beneath where eyes do not look. Lily was to be married in 3 days. The thought sat strange in her chest, like tea gone cold. It wasn't fear, exactly. Nor was it joy. It was something between, a dull ache of duty mixed with a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this was what belonging might feel like. Lem Garrison had chosen her. A rancher's son with sun-scorched skin and a swagger that made boots echo louder than steps. He was not cruel. Nor was he kind. He was simply there, and Lily had learned that sometimes, being seen, even if dimly, was enough to keep a heart from breaking. She passed old Eustace the blacksmith, who lifted his hat with a nod. His eyes lingered, not out of admiration, but a soft concern he never voiced. Everyone knew of the wedding. The town wasn't big enough for secrets. The preacher's wife had already started cutting lace. At home, the kitchen smelled of cornbread and sweet tallow soap. Aunt Mirabelle stood at the stove, her back stiff, her gray hair pinned into its usual war-ready bun. "You're back late," she said, without turning. "I was with the lilies," Lily murmured, setting a bundle of them down gently on the table. "They're blooming early." Aunt Mirabelle grunted. "Means a dry season." There was no hug, no touch. But Mirabelle sliced the cornbread thinner than usual and slid the end piece, Lily's favorite, onto her plate. That night, Lily lay in bed listening to the hush between gusts of prairie wind. Her wedding dress hung near the window, white as clouded milk. It was simple, borrowed from her aunt's younger days. She had taken it in herself, needle shaking only a little as she stitched the hem to fit her smaller frame. She wondered if Lem would notice, or care. When she dreamed, it was not of wedding bells, but of her mother singing by the firelight, voice like river water and just as gone. Morning came with the clatter of hooves and the buzz of nervous whispers. 3 days folded into one, and now the day had arrived. The chapel stood proud and humble at once, a wooden cross above its door catching the full light of noon. Inside, Lily stood with her hands folded tight, bouquet of lilies cradled like a fragile promise. Her heart beat with quiet force beneath her ribs, not fast, but deep, like a drum muffled under layers of cloth. The guests filled the pews, neighbors, shopkeepers, the preacher's wide-eyed daughters. Faces turned as the doors opened. But it was not Lem who entered. It was his brother first. Then his father, looking grave. Then, finally, Lem, late, unshaven, with a look on his face like he'd swallowed a stone and couldn't spit it out. He reached the altar, glanced down at Lily, and his mouth tightened. She's shorter than I thought," he muttered. Not loudly, but not low enough. It passed through the chapel like a winter draft. Lily blinked once. The lilies trembled in her grip. Lem's hands fumbled with his cuffs. I can't. I just can't." He turned, boots echoing, and walked out without another word. No one moved at first. Not even the preacher. Silence swept over the room like a storm cloud. Lily inhaled. Just once. Then, with care, she placed the bouquet on the pulpit and stepped down the aisle. Her chin did not rise, nor did it fall. Her eyes, clear and unreadable, looked straight ahead. She passed each face like pages in a book she'd already read. Outside, the sun was fierce but hollow. Dust lifted around her feet. Somewhere, a child cried softly, hushed by a mother who didn't know what to say. She did not cry. She walked until the chapel was no longer in sight. Past the townsfolk who didn't speak. Past the curious, the pitying, the confused. Her wedding dress collected dirt and grass, but she did not lift the hem. Let it catch the world. Let it carry her grief. The edge of town came fast, as though the land wanted to meet her pain with its own wide quiet. There, at the last fence post, she stopped. She did not know what came next. Only that she could not return. She turned toward the open plains, and for the first time in weeks, breathed fully. Behind her, someone approached, not with haste, not with urgency, but with intention. The footsteps were slow, solid. She turned, expecting another whisper of condolence. Instead, she saw a man she barely recognized. Tall, dressed plainly. A beard like river stone. Eyes not sharp, but steady. He held no flowers. Only his coat in his hands. When he reached her, he did not offer pity. He did not speak. He simply draped the coat over her shoulders and stood beside her, eyes on the land. And though not a word passed between them, Lily Bell Franklin understood one thing with crystal certainty. Some people arrive not to rescue, but to witness. And that, sometimes, is enough to begin again. The morning broke with the weight of quiet expectation. Sunlight stretched its golden fingers across Harmony Ridge, warming the dewed fields and wood-paneled porches with the promise of celebration. The chapel, a simple white structure at the end of a narrow path, stood ready. Polished floors, fresh paint on the doorframe, and a soft scattering of daisies along the windowsills. Inside, the pews were already half filled with townsfolk in their Sunday best, hats removed, voices low. The air held a curious tension, like breath held too long. Lily Bell Franklin stood behind the chapel, in the small vestibule where brides waited in solitude. Her hands rested gently against the skirt of her dress, smoothing imaginary wrinkles with fingers that barely trembled. The gown hung loose at the shoulders, fitted only by hours of her own careful stitching. Her aunt had helped with the buttons that morning, not speaking much, only adjusting the collar as if it mattered more than it did. Lily's bonnet had been traded for a single sprig of baby's breath, pinned behind her ear. She watched dust stir through a crack in the window and imagined it was wind trying to get in. The door creaked open and the preacher's wife entered, her round face warm but hesitant. She handed Lily a bouquet of prairie lilies, fresh, fragrant, gathered with intention. "Just about time, child," she said gently, though she didn't meet Lily's eyes for long. Lily gave a soft nod, barely moving her head. Her voice came as a whisper wrapped in breath. "Is he here?" "Soon," was the reply. The preacher's wife left the door open behind her. Lily stepped forward, into the narrow hall that led to the chapel proper. From behind the curtain, she could hear the subtle shifting of the crowd, boots scuffing wood, throats clearing, the murmured sigh of someone folding a fan. Her breath slowed, eyes soft and still. She was not excited, not afraid. What she felt was something else entirely, something unnameable, as if her whole self were waiting to see whether this would be the moment life finally folded her in. She heard the doors open. Voices quieted. She waited for the music. But it didn't begin. Instead, a longer pause. The scrape of a boot dragging. Then, louder now, the sound of someone entering alone. Through the curtain's edge, she glimpsed Lem Garrison. He looked different. Not dressed as he had promised. His vest was wrinkled, and his collar wilted in the heat. His hair had not been combed clean. There was a line of sweat across his brow, but no sign of nerves in his stance. Only reluctance, like a man dragging a plow he never meant to harness. He reached the altar and stood still. The preacher, already in place, looked toward the back, then toward Lem. His expression shifted. The curtain stirred behind Lily. She stepped forward. The hush in the chapel grew deeper. It wasn't reverence, it was uncertainty. She entered the aisle. Gasps rose from a few lips, though quickly stilled. The chapel held its breath. Lily walked slowly, her eyes not darting, but resting on one point at a time. The old beam above the door, the way the light fell through the window, the bow on the youngest girl's braid in the front pew. Each step was a quiet vow to herself. She did not feel beautiful. She felt present, and that would have to be enough. Lem didn't reach for her hand when she arrived. Instead, he stepped back a fraction. Barely a movement, but clear. She turned toward him. His eyes flicked to the guests, then down to her. His lips parted. What came out was not planned. It was not kind. "She's smaller than I thought." It was a murmur, but it rolled through the room like thunder in a canyon. The preacher's mouth closed. Lily's breath caught. No one spoke. Lem shifted again, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry. I can't." He looked at the preacher, then the crowd, then finally back at Lily with something close to guilt but not quite. "I can't marry her," he said. "Not like this." He turned, shoulders hunched, and walked away. His footsteps clapped across the chapel floor, then softened as the door closed behind him. The silence left behind was a shape of its own. Not shock, not sorrow. Just vastness. Stillness. Lily stood in it. 1 second. Then 2. She blinked, but did not lower her head. With quiet hands, she reached up and adjusted the sprig of baby's breath. Then, she stepped to the pulpit, set the lilies down as gently as if they were her mother's favorite teacup, and turned. No one moved. As she walked back down the aisle, she passed faces that tried to offer comfort in glances, but none could reach her. Their silence was a wall. Their pity, a heavy cloth she did not care to wear. She stepped into the sun alone. Outside, the wind had picked up. The prairie stretched endlessly, sky like a faded quilt stitched by years of sun. The grass bowed with the breeze, not in mourning but in rhythm. Life, indifferent and steady. She walked until she was past the chapel, then past the steps, and into the open road where the air tasted like dry sage and beginnings. A child ran from her mother's grip and toward Lily, offering a dropped flower petal from the ceremony. The mother rushed after, whispering apologies, pulling the child back. Lily smiled at the girl, a smile that held no bitterness. Then she kept walking. No tears fell. Her hands stayed loose at her sides. She reached the bridge that crossed the shallow creek, the one she used to sit beneath as a child with her feet in the water, dreaming of what life might bring when she grew tall. She wasn't tall now, but she was grown. And that, she thought, was something. A rider passed behind her, slowing his horse as he neared. It wasn't Lem. It was August Hale. He did not speak. He simply watched her from the shade of his wide-brimmed hat, then dismounted quietly and approached. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't bow or apologize or offer her his name. He knew she knew it. She'd sold him a button once at her aunt's shop, and she remembered the way he had thanked her as if she'd done something far greater than find the right size. Today, he did nothing grand. Just took off his coat and held it out to her. Lily hesitated, then accepted it. Not because she was cold, but because it seemed right. He walked beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be distant. Just there. Together, they crossed the bridge and headed into the wide openness beyond, where no one had yet decided what story must be told. Behind them, the chapel faded from view. And ahead of them, the horizon waited without judgment. The rain began that night. Not in a storm, not in a fury, but with a steady, weeping gentleness that soaked into the earth as if the sky had finally decided to share its sorrow. The kind of rain that softened fences, quieted chickens, and brought the scent of tilled soil into every corner of Harmony Ridge. Lily sat by the window of her room, the cotton coat folded neatly over her lap. She had not spoken much since the wedding that wasn't. Not because she was angry. Not because she didn't have words. but because nothing she could say felt truer than silence. Her aunt moved through the house like a careful ghost, folding linens tighter than they needed to be, boiling the tea longer than it required. She did not ask questions. Instead, she left warm bread by Lily's door and adjusted the curtains so the light might fall more kindly on her face. The coat still smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh cotton. August Hale had said nothing when he gave it to her. Not a word. But something in the gesture had settled into Lily's chest and grown roots. He had not rushed to fix her pain, nor pretended not to see it. He had simply shown up. The next day, he returned, not with apologies or questions, but with a bundle of raw cotton, pure white and gathered by hand. "It's from the far field," he said, placing it on her porch table. "Thought you might quilt with it." Lily looked down at the cotton. Her fingers brushed the soft tufts. "It's clean." He nodded. "Always is, if you pick it careful." She didn't ask why he'd come. He didn't explain. After that, he came often. Not daily. Just enough for the visits to feel like a pattern rather than a surprise. He would bring small things, beeswax candles, a jar of preserves, once a book of pressed flowers with a note inside written in slow, careful script. "Thought you might like the lavender best." Sometimes he stayed to talk. Sometimes he just sat while Lily mended fabric or shelled peas. His voice was low, roughened by dust and quiet days, but his words always felt deliberate, placed with intention like stones along a garden path. Lily learned he had lost his wife 3 winters past. Consumption, quick and cruel. He didn't speak of it much, but once, while watching the evening clouds, he said her name, Maribel, as if testing whether it still echoed. He owned a modest cotton mill at the southern edge of town. Not large, but kept in fair condition. Hired only local hands. Paid them well. The town respected him, though few claimed to know him deeply. Lily began to wonder how many people simply preferred to stay unknown. One afternoon, he found her by the stream, sleeves rolled as she gathered wild mint. He didn't call out, just stepped near and knelt beside her, pulling a few leaves himself with practiced hands. "You always do things quiet," Lily said softly. He looked at her, eyes the color of worn stone. "Noise doesn't make the work truer." She smiled then, not the shy, folded smile she gave to townsfolk in passing, but one that touched her eyes, as if something inside her had just remembered warmth. They sat a while without speaking, the mint piled between them. Bees droned lazily around the blossoms, and the clouds rolled like ships across the sky. Later that week, he brought her a basket. Inside, fabric scraps dyed in soft colors. Clay red, prairie green, milk blue. "You could quilt something new," he said. Lily ran her fingers across the cloth. "Most folks would offer a dress." He tilted his head. "A dress is for show. Quilts are for keeping warm." She met his gaze. "You think I need warmth?" "No," he said, slow and certain. "But I think you deserve it." The days turned longer. The air smelled of hay and harvest. Lily found herself looking toward the road in the afternoons, half hoping he'd appear. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. But when he was gone, the silence no longer felt so hollow. One day, he arrived with a wooden box. "It was Maribel's," he said. "She kept thread in it." Lily opened it slowly. Inside, a thimble, a rusted needle, and a slip of cloth with the beginnings of a stitch, a daisy halfway finished. "I never could throw it out," he said. "Figured maybe it'd like a second try." Lily didn't speak for a long moment. Then she placed the box on her lap and rested her hand over it gently. "You're not trying to fix me," she said, more observation than question. "No," August replied. "I just want to see what you make next." That evening, Lily began to sew, not out of obligation, not from the ache of proving herself, but because her fingers itched for rhythm. The quilt came slowly, one patch at a time, stitched from memory and cotton. The hem of her old wedding dress became a border. The lilies from that day, embroidered in the center, bloomed again. In town, people began to notice. The grocer asked after her. The preacher's wife came to call, bringing extra sugar. Folks talked less of the wedding and more of how she'd carried herself after. Lem Garrison returned once. Walked into the shop, hat in hand, face uncertain. "I didn't handle things right," he said. Lily met his eyes, calm as a lake before dawn. "No," she agreed. "But I thank you for your honesty." He looked relieved, confused. "I wish you well, Lem," she added, with a softness that surprised even her. He nodded, shuffled his boots, and left. He didn't come back. Later that week, August arrived to help fix the roof. He climbed with practiced ease, hands steady, boots sure. Lily watched from below, handing him tools, laughing once when he dropped a nail and muttered something under his breath. "You've got a good laugh," he said when he came down. "It's rare," she replied. "Then I'll try to earn it again." They sat side by side that evening, watching the stars stitch themselves into the sky. "Did you ever think you'd marry again?" Lily asked. August was quiet for a long time. "Didn't think I'd want to. And now?" He looked at her. Not through her. Not around her. At her. "I think I'd like to stand beside someone again. Not to fix. Not to carry. Just to stand." Lily's eyes did not shy away. "Me too." They did not speak of love. Not yet. It was something deeper they shared, like two seeds planted near each other, growing slowly in the same soil. As the days shortened and the wind carried the first promise of autumn, Lily placed the last stitch in the quilt. It was not perfect, but it was warm and full of color. She folded it carefully and set it on the porch swing. August arrived not long after, with a loaf of bread still warm from his kitchen. Lily lifted the quilt, spread it over both their shoulders, and said, simply, "Stay a while." And he did. The morning sun filtered through the cotton curtains like honey poured through gauze, slow and amber and warm. It painted long streaks across the wooden floorboards of the Franklin house, and in their stillness, Lily sat sewing by the window. The needle moved in patient rhythm, her fingers guiding it through soft cotton with care learned not from textbooks or instructors, but from quiet hours spent listening to fabric, watching how it folded and yielded and carried the weight of warmth. Outside, the wind tickled the tall grass, and birds sang their slow, lonesome songs, the kind that made a heart ache and swell at the same time. August Hale had not visited for 3 days. It wasn't unusual. He came and went like the tide, never overstepping, never assuming. But absence, Lily had come to realize, was more noticeable when it was gentle hands you missed. She found herself looking toward the road out of habit now, not with yearning, but with a softness she hadn't known she still possessed. When he did arrive that afternoon, she was in the garden, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in the stubborn roots of a creeping weed that had taken to choking the marigolds. She heard the horse before she saw him, the slow clop of hooves on dirt. She didn't look up right away, not until he dismounted and approached, hat in hand, his shadow falling beside hers. "Thought I'd find you here," he said. Lily leaned back on her heels, brushing soil from her hands. "It's always where I end up when something's on my mind." He crouched beside her, pulling off his gloves. "What's on your mind?" She studied the marigolds. How something so bright can be so easy to miss until it's nearly gone. August nodded. Sometimes the loudest colors are the quietest flowers. She glanced at him then. "And what brings you?" He reached into his satchel and pulled out a book. Worn leather cover, pages yellowed with age. It was my mother's. A collection of poems. "I thought maybe you'd want to read one aloud with me sometime." Lily took the book, turning it in her hands as if it were a relic. "You keep giving me things." "I give what I have," he said. "You make it feel useful." They sat there in the dirt, sun lowering behind them. There was no rush, no plan. Just the sound of wind and the slow hum of something that felt like understanding. In the weeks that followed, they spent more time together, not in grand gestures or courtship rituals, but in the quiet routine of shared space. August helped her fix the porch rail. Lily taught him how to bake biscuits that didn't come out hard as fence posts. They read from the poetry book in the evenings, trading stanzas like secrets, smiling at the lines that stirred something in them both. He showed her how cotton was processed, how it moved from plant to bale, cleaned, combed, spun. His hands were deft and respectful, never forcing, only guiding. Lily watched the fibers stretch and twist, rawness turn to thread. She thought about that often, how something coarse could be coaxed into softness with time and patience. One late afternoon, they sat on the mill porch, sipping sweet tea. The sun had dipped just enough to cast a bronze tint across the fields, and the smell of cotton drifted like memory on the wind. August turned to her. "Do you know what silk's made from?" She shook her head. "Worms," he said. "Little caterpillars, working in silence. They spin themselves into something delicate, something fine." Lily smiled. "So even the lowliest creatures can create beauty." He looked at her then with a gaze that didn't try to pierce, but rather to hold. "Sometimes it's the ones closest to the ground who carry the strongest threads." She lowered her eyes, that soft warmth blooming in her chest again. It came without warning these days, as natural as breath. But not everyone looked on their closeness with grace. Harmony Ridge was a small town, and small towns noticed everything. There were whispers now, around the general store, at the post office, in the pews before Sunday sermon. Some said August was too old, too weathered. Others said Lily had moved on too quickly, that she should have carried her heartbreak a little longer for decency's sake. Lily heard them. She always had. She'd lived her life under the weight of sideways glances, of opinions disguised as concern. But she'd grown tired of bending herself into shapes that pleased others. And when August came by one morning with a hand-carved spindle for her quilting, she took it without hesitation, letting the townsfolk wonder. Still, one voice among the many stung more than most. Her Aunt Mirabelle. They sat at the table that evening, the stew untouched between them. "You see him too much," Mirabelle said. Lily didn't respond right away. She reached for her spoon, stirred the stew, let the silence stretch. "I see him just enough. He's not what your mother would have wanted." "My mother isn't here to want anything." Mirabelle stiffened. "People talk. They always have. Doesn't mean they're right." The old woman sighed, a sound like wood creaking in wind. "You were hurt, Lily. You need time." Lily looked up, her voice steady. "Time is not a thing I wait for to tell me how I feel. It's something I live. And I'm living it." Mirabelle said nothing more. But the distance settled between them like dust, soft but stubborn. The next morning, August didn't come. Nor the next. Lily stitched instead. Her quilt grew larger, the center now a bloom of lilies surrounded by cotton fields, the border shaped from the pieces of her old wedding dress, now faded to ivory. On the third day, he arrived again. No flowers, no bundle in hand. Just August, standing at the fence, hat in hand, the sky behind him a soft gray, heavy with the scent of coming rain. Lily stepped out to meet him. "Did you need time?" she asked, voice calm but not cold. "No," he said. "I needed to listen to the wind a while. It reminded me not to let other people's noise become my own voice." She nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "It gets loud, doesn't it?" He looked at her, not smiling, but eyes warm. "Quieter when I'm near you." They walked then, past the house, through the fields where cotton bowed to the breeze. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. At the edge of the field, they stopped. "I've been thinking," August said. "Not about proposals. Not about weddings. Just about partnership." Lily tilted her head. "And what does that look like to you?" "Two people growing toward the same sun. Side by side. Not rushing. Not pulling. Just choosing each other every day." Lily turned to him fully, the wind tugging at her skirt. "And what if the sun moves?" "Then we move with it," he said. "Together." That night, Lily placed her finished quilt on her bed. She lay beneath it with the window open, letting the night air carry in the scent of cotton, wood smoke, and rain. She slept without dreaming, wrapped in something that felt not like love's fire, but love's hearth, steady, enduring, quietly warm. The next day, she wore her tallest boots, the ones that gave her a little more reach, and walked into town with her head high. She stopped at the grocer's, the post office, the chapel. People looked, and she looked back. No shame. No explanations. She found August at the mill, sleeves rolled, his hands full of thread. "Have you ever made silk?" she asked. He looked up, brow lifted slightly. "No. Just cotton." She stepped closer. "Would you like to learn?" He set down the thread. "With you. With me." And so, they did. Not all at once. Not with vows or ribbons or crowds. But in the way threads become fabric, slowly, stitch by stitch, until one day you wrap it around yourself and realize it's home. The day began with wind. Not a fierce one, but a wild, laughing wind that tugged at the curtains and rattled the porch swing, as if it were eager to announce something the earth had waited too long to say. Lily rose with it, the hem of her nightgown brushing the newly polished floor as she crossed the room. Outside the window, the cotton fields had burst into full bloom overnight, white blossoms catching the morning light like the sky had snowed only on her land. It was a sight that made her pause. She had grown up believing that weddings were meant to be grand, gilded with lace, heavy with witness, filled with ceremony and expectation. But now, standing barefoot in her home, she understood that the truest things didn't require noise. They needed stillness, presence, willing hands, a heart that knew how to remain. August had arrived at dawn, quiet as always. His coat smelled of tobacco and warm cedar. He waited on the porch, hat in hand, wearing a shirt Lily had mended for him the week before. It fit better now, the fabric softer from repeated wear. His boots were dusty, his expression unreadable in the early light, but when she stepped outside, he looked at her like the wind itself had stopped to make room. "I didn't want to knock," he said, "if you weren't sure." Lily stood before him, face turned slightly to the morning sun. "I was sure yesterday," she answered, "but I wanted the light to agree with me." He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't try to prove anything, only confessed. They walked together across the field. The grass had turned gold with the season, but the cotton held firm, white against the fading world, a last flourish of summer's generosity. A few neighbors had been invited, not many. Aunt Mirabel, despite her usual tight-lipped ways, stood near the tree line with her arms folded, her best dress pressed flat as Sunday prayer. Her eyes did not shine, but they held no resistance either. There was a quiet truce in her gaze, and perhaps a small, buried pride. Reverend Harmon stood beneath the cottonwood tree that August had planted 5 years ago. It was taller now, its branches stretched like arms into the sky. Beneath its shade, a patchwork quilt had been laid out, Lily's quilt. The one stitched from moments. Her old wedding dress hem had become a border of lilies, and August's cotton scraps softened its center. They did not walk down an aisle. They walked together. No one rose from pews. There were no pews. Only the wind, the cotton, and the steady hush of the world listening. When they reached the tree, Lily turned toward August. She wore no veil, only a ribbon in her hair, and a smile that had grown out of soil and sorrow and slow, sweet mornings. August looked at her, not as a man dazzled, but as one moved, by reverence, not possession. The Reverend spoke softly, his voice barely rising above the rustle of leaves. "Why have you come?" August answered, his tone sure but tender. "To stand beside her. Not to rescue. Not to promise things I can't know. But to walk the rest of the way." The Reverend turned to Lily. "And you?" Lily's voice held no tremble. "Because he sees me without asking me to change. Because he waited when others turned away. And because I am no longer small when I am with him." The Reverend smiled. "And do you bind yourselves to each other freely?" "We do," they said as one. There were no rings. Instead, Lily reached into her pocket and took out a spool of thread, silk white, thin but strong. August extended his hand, and she wound it once around his wrist, then once around hers. A single knot tied, delicate, perfect. "I don't want a chain," she said. "Just something that reminds me we chose this. Every day." August kissed her palm. Then the wind lifted again, tousling Lily's hair and tugging at the quilt corners. It carried the scent of cotton and soil and the soft hum of the living world. There was no applause, only smiles, and the subtle stillness of something sacred. After the vows, there was food, simple, good. Bread still warm, peach preserves, sweet tea. They sat on the quilt while the sun dipped lower. Aunt Mirabel surprised Lily by bringing a small pie and placing it wordlessly at her side. Later, Lily would notice a few extra rows had been added to the hem of her wedding dress, neat and even. Mirabel had always sewn her care sideways. As dusk painted the sky in purples and ember gold, Lily and August rose and stepped into the field. They moved without music, their dance more sway than step. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, and his hand at her back was steady, respectful, real. The cotton surrounded them, soft as snowfall, the air thick with the hush of dusk and something too full for words. In that quiet, August whispered just once, "You were never small, Lily. Only the world's eyes were too dim to see you." She held him tighter. When the night deepened, stars broke open overhead. Lanterns were lit, their glow soft against the sky. The guests thinned, drifting away with the wind, but Lily and August remained beneath the tree. They spoke little. The thread still wrapped around their wrists, loose now, but intact. Lily stared at the sky. "Did you ever think," she asked, "that love might find you when you had already given up searching?" "I didn't give up," he said. "I just stopped looking for what wasn't real. And me. You're real." He kissed her then, not with passion, but with peace. It was the kind of kiss that came at the end of a long letter. A signature written with two hands. Later, they sat side by side on the quilt, the earth warm beneath them, the air ripe with the scent of cotton and new beginnings. Lily rested her hand over August's heart. "It feels steady," she said. "It's because you're near." "I think," she whispered, "this is the wedding I was meant for." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive with fanfare or promises. It comes as thread, as warmth, as a field full of white blossoms that bloom despite the wind. And for Lily Bell Franklin, once rejected for standing small in a world too blind to bend down and see her, it came as cotton turned to silk in the hands of a man who never asked her to grow taller, only to be seen. So if ever you find yourself left at a chapel's door, told you are not enough, not whole, not tall enough to be loved, remember Lily. Remember that not all flowers bloom tall. Some grow closest to the heart, where the light is softer, and the soil, though quiet, never forgets how to hold something gently. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best weddings begin with a walk through the fields. Snow fell not like weather but like memory, soft, persistent, and without apology. It smoothed over the jagged wounds of the land, whispered across broken fences and brittle twigs, muffling the wild edges of the world. Out on the edge of Pine Hollow, past where the town dared to keep roads, stood a crooked-limbed cabin made of old wood and older silence. Inside, a woman moved like smoke, quiet, practiced, deliberate. Her name was Bonnie McGuire. She was 36, though no one in town ever said so aloud. She'd once been called a fine wife when her husband was alive, then a fine widow when he wasn't. Not much changed in how they looked at her, except that now they expected less. Bonnie wore grief the way others wore aprons, tied about her middle, hands always half wiped on it. But hers wasn't the kind that wailed or drank or threw itself onto caskets. It was the kind that baked bread in the dark, mended sleeves that would never be worn again, and wrote thoughts in the margins of the newspaper long after the ink had dried. Her days were made of wood smoke and water hauling, of tending to a lean milk goat named Letty and brushing out the horse whose name she'd never changed from what her husband had given it, Marshall. She let the fire burn low sometimes just to see how long she could stand the cold. It was a cold day that changed things. A deep, devouring cold that cracked even the strongest pine bones. That morning, the wind had howled strange, not wild, not mournful, but warning. Bonnie had bundled herself for the woods, axe in hand, to collect the last dry kindling before the sky turned to ice. That's when she saw it. At first, it was just a shape, half swallowed by snow. A dark, crooked thing sprawled between brush and fallen logs. She approached slow, boots crunching, hands steady on the axe handle. A man. No, a shadow of one. His skin was darker than the earth, hair braided with beads and blood, a woven sash soaked through and frozen to his side. Apache. That word came into her head not as an accusation but as a whisper, shaped by the voices of town gossip and whispered fireside fear. He was dying. That much was clear. Snow had started to blanket his legs like a burial rite. His breath was shallow, fluttering in his throat like a moth caught in linen. She stood above him a long while, her own breath blooming into fog. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to leave him. Let the land finish what it started. But Bonnie Maguire had never been much for what passed as sensible in Pine Hollow. She dropped the axe. It didn't feel like a decision, more like a moment she'd been walking toward for years. Getting him back to the cabin took half her strength and all her will. He was heavy with unconsciousness, dead weight that sagged and dragged. Her fingers screamed in the cold, knees bruised from kneeling, back wet with sweat that turned to frost. She whispered apologies to the woods, to her husband's ghost, to the future. Inside, she laid him by the fire, stripped the wet from his limbs, cleaned the wound at his side with hands that didn't shake until they were finished. His blood was darker than hers, richer somehow, like the earth after rain. She packed the wound with moss and cloth, whispered prayers she barely remembered how to say. He didn't wake. Not that night. Not the next. But he breathed. Bonnie slept in the rocking chair those days, keeping one eye on the man she did not know, her rifle close but her fear further. She left water by his side, changed his bandages, watched for signs that death had taken notice. And through it all, she said nothing. Not aloud. Not to him. The cabin took on a new shape, as all homes do when something fragile enters. Every sound became sharper. The creak of the rafters, the stir of the fire, the wind's mutterings through the shutters. The quiet was no longer empty. It held breath and hope and questions. On the fourth morning, his eyes opened. They were the color of dark smoke, watching her without flinching, though she saw confusion in them. She met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to barter but honesty. She did not smile. She did not look away. "You're safe," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "For now." He didn't speak. Not then. But his eyes lingered. Not on her face, on her hands, bandaged from cold and work. As if wondering what made her carry him from death's edge when others would have turned away. Bonnie did not ask his name. Names had power, and it felt too early for power between them. She thought instead about the day the town might come knocking, about what they would say, and how they would call her soft, foolish, even traitor. But none of that was now. Now was tea made from pine needles and thin broth from bones she'd meant to save. Now was the fire, and the man who didn't die. She found herself studying him when he slept. Not out of fear, that had eased, but out of something quieter, more curious. His face was weathered but not old. His hands, even in stillness, looked like they belonged to someone who knew the land better than maps ever could. He had a scar along his jaw, like a knife had once tried to steal his words. He healed slowly, ate little, watched the window more than he watched her. Days passed like smoke drifting up a chimney. One evening, as the light sank into blue, Bonnie sat beside the fire reading aloud from an old farming almanac. Not for him, not at first. Just to hear her own voice again, the way it filled the cracks in the silence. He listened. And she felt it, the shift. The moment when presence became companionship, when the lines between stranger and something else began to blur. He pointed at a word in the book once. A simple act, wordless. But it made her heart startle in her chest. It meant he understood. It meant he was choosing to stay present. That night, she left an extra blanket by his bedroll. She didn't say why. The wind outside howled again. Another storm was coming. She could feel it in her teeth, in the ache that lived in her bones since her husband died. Bonnie sat long that night, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing mingled with the crackle of fire. It struck her, quietly, that for the first time in many winters, she wasn't alone. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But she didn't dread morning the way she used to. Out beyond the cabin, The snow fell in steady drifts, covering tracks and truths alike. The trees whispered to each other in a tongue too old for humans to hold. In Pine Hollow, no one knew what the widow had done. Not yet. But winter knows how to keep secrets, at least for a while. The days settled into rhythm, soft as breath, deliberate as snowfall. Inside the cabin, where once only grief lived, there now flickered a fragile and unspoken understanding. The man, still unnamed, though not unacknowledged, grew stronger in slow, steady inches. His fever had broken, though his wound remained a taut and aching thing. Bonnie, with sleeves always rolled, tended him with the same quiet persistence she gave to her woodpile or bread dough. She asked nothing of him, not even his name. It was not mercy she offered, not exactly. It was something slower, deeper. A waiting. He spoke no English. Or, if he did, he chose not to use it. Instead, he nodded when she passed him broth, held her gaze longer than required, listened as she read aloud from newspapers or yellowing herb journals. Their communication unfolded like the unfurling of cold hands beside a fire, gradual, unsure, then unmistakably warm. Sometimes he watched her work, eyes tracking the movement of her hands. She worked with grace forged by years of necessity. Even her silences had a rhythm. He watched her chop wood, kneel in the snow to fix a broken fence, stitch the worn lining of her coat. She moved with a stubbornness he recognized. Survival, not pride. She called him you, or sometimes nothing at all. He never corrected her. And she didn't think of him as an intruder anymore. He'd become, somehow, part of the cabin's breath. An echo made flesh. She found herself making a second cup of tea without thinking. Found herself brushing snow from the windows so he could see the moonlight. One night, as dusk bruised the edges of the sky, she caught him standing barefoot by the door, staring at the trees. His hand touched the frame, not as if to leave but as if remembering something. She didn't speak. Only offered a blanket, which he took without thanks, but not without acknowledgement. He began to help in small ways. First, he pulled water from the well when her shoulder ached. Then he swept the cabin floor without being asked. She noticed, but said nothing. Gratitude, she had learned, was best shown in kind. They did not need words. Their silences stretched long but not lonely. When she read aloud, he would sometimes trace shapes in the air, sketching something only he could see. Once he pointed to a sketch she'd made in the dirt with her boot, a crooked pine tree, and nodded. She drew another beside it. He smiled, only a little, and it was the first time she realized how young he might be. Not a boy. Not a man worn by age either. Somewhere in that middle space like her. Each night, they shared a fire and a roof and the invisible tether of two souls who had nowhere else to be. But Bonnie knew the world beyond their four walls would not be kind if it found him here. Her cabin was only a temporary shelter, never a refuge that could last. She knew the town would not understand. Pine Hollow was built on fences, wooden, spoken, unwritten. They had strict expectations for women, for grief, for strangers. Especially strangers with skin like his, with beads in his hair and silence as his first language. She remembered the stories her husband used to tell around the fire. Stories meant to stir fear. Of raids and horse thieves. Of Apache warriors who took what they wanted and left smoke behind. He'd puff out his chest when he told them, the other men nodding with the comfort of having something to fear more than themselves. Bonnie had nodded too, back then. Not because she believed it, but because disbelief didn't change the way men chose to live. But now, as she handed the man another cup of tea, her fingers brushing his, she felt the weight of those stories pressing against the truth she now lived with. This was no monster, no savage. He was a man who flinched when the wind howled and sat with quiet reverence before the fire. He never asked to stay, but he hadn't tried to leave. The snow outside piled high, walling them in with white silence. Time slowed, softened. The world became very small, just two people, a hearth, and the tasks of each day. They shared food, heat, and the stillness of snow-covered evenings. She mended his shirt, found beads hidden in the hem that she left untouched. He patched her roof during a brief thaw, his hands sure, his movements reverent. One morning, She found him watching her feed Letty, the goat. He stood still, arms crossed, brow furrowed as if puzzling out something deeper than the task. She caught his eye and tilted her head toward the barn. "You ever keep goats?" she asked, already knowing he wouldn't answer. But his mouth curled at the corner, and he shook his head. Then pointed to the sky. She looked up. Gray clouds. Rolling. Storm again. He nodded. And in that moment, she understood they had come to an agreement, wordless and honest. He would not lie, and she would not demand. There was no need. The days ahead were colder. At night, the wind groaned through the eaves like a mourning voice. Bonnie lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sound of his breathing from across the room. Not snoring. Just breathing. Human. Alive. Real. Sometimes, in dreams, she saw him as she'd found him, half frozen, bleeding into the snow. But in the dream he opened his eyes first. Always first. And he looked at her not with fear or pleading, but with recognition, as if he had been waiting for her all along. She woke from those dreams not afraid, but hollowed out. Like the dream had pulled something from her chest and left a little light behind. One night, after a long silence broken only by the hiss of the fire, he spoke. His voice was quiet, the vowels rounded and slow. "Why?" She looked up from her sewing. She knew what he meant. Why had she helped him? Why had she not turned away? She considered the fire, the shape of her hands in her lap, the feeling she hadn't had words for until now. "Because you were dying," she said. He shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving hers. She nodded. "Because I was too." And there it was, the first moment not shared but joined. His face shifted, a frown softened by grief, not anger. He looked away only to watch the fire, as if reading something in its movement. The next morning, he handed her a carved stick. It wasn't elaborate, but it had care in it. A bird, wings open, not flying but ready to. She didn't ask what it meant. She understood. It was his way of saying thank you, or maybe stay alive. The rhythm of their days didn't change much after that. But the silences did. They weren't gaps anymore. They were bridges. A shared language not of grammar or sound, but of being seen. Still, Bonnie felt something shifting. Not inside the cabin, but beyond it. A sense that the world outside had begun to stir again. That the stillness they'd been borrowing was about to be reclaimed. One afternoon, while chopping wood, she saw a set of horse tracks cut fresh through the snow at the treeline. Not Tayan's. Not hers. Too deep. Too straight. Someone had come near, maybe watched. She said nothing to the man that night. But she didn't sleep. The next morning, he stood near the window, watching the trees. He turned and looked at her. No words. She nodded. Something was coming. But it had not come yet. And so, she poured another cup of tea, sat beside him, and let the silence speak what their voices could not. The morning they came was soft and silver with frost. The trees stood still, as if listening. The snow had hardened under the night's breath, crusted thick where even the wind dared not tread. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of simmered beans and pine smoke. Tayan was shaping a piece of wood near the fire, slow strokes of his knife carving into the grain with a patience that reminded Bonnie of old rivers, silent but determined. She was spinning yarn from a tangle of old wool. Her hands moved without needing to look. They'd grown so used to this shared quiet that she almost missed the sound. Hooves. Not one. Several. They didn't approach fast. It was not a raid, not a rescue. It was a decision arriving on horseback, wrapped in coats and law and fear. Bonnie stood slowly, heart climbing to her throat. Tayan was already looking at her. His knife was still. His eyes said what neither of them would say aloud. They've come. The knock was not a knock. It was fists and command. The door rattled once, twice. She opened it without reaching for her rifle. That would only make it worse. 3 men stood there, their breath steaming like war horses, coats dusted white, guns easy on their hips. One was the sheriff, Gregory Kane, a man with salt in his beard and gravel in his voice. The others were ranchers, younger, but not gentler. "Bonnie," Kane said, tilting his head in a mockery of politeness, "we need to talk." Her mouth was dry. "You're early for coffee." "No one's here for coffee," said the one on the left, a sharp-jawed boy named Virgil who once courted her niece. "He's in there, ain't he?" Bonnie didn't look back. "He's healing." Kane stepped forward, boots crunching on the frozen threshold. "That man in there, he's Apache. We've had reports. You know what kind of trouble that brings." She looked him in the eye. "I know what kind of trouble fear makes." "Don't test me, Bonnie," Kane said, voice low, almost sad. "People are stirred up. He's not safe here. And you—" He stopped, eyes flickering past her shoulder. "You're making things harder than they need to be." There was a weight to those words, heavy and lined with threat. Bonnie didn't move aside. "He's not a threat." Virgil stepped forward. "You don't know that. He could have been part of the raid near Dry Ridge. Took 3 horses and 2 lives. He's been in this cabin for over a month," she said. "I pulled him from the snow. You think he rode out from Dry Ridge while bleeding to death in the dark?" The third man, silent until now, shifted uneasily. His eyes met hers with a flicker of doubt. He knew she was telling the truth. But knowing the truth was never enough in Pine Hollow. You had to want it. Kane let out a long breath. "Bonnie, listen. We can't have him here. Not like this. Folks are scared. They need resolution." The word sat foul in the air, as if justice could be measured like grain. Bonnie stepped back, not in fear but in surrender to the inevitable. "If you want him, you'll have to see him." Kane nodded. Virgil's hand twitched near his belt, but Kane gestured him down. "Easy. Just a look." They entered with their boots still muddy. Tayan stood at the hearth, not holding a weapon, not speaking. Just watching. The sheriff looked at him, long and careful. Tayan didn't flinch. His face was stone, but his eyes were not. They held calm, and something deeper, contempt maybe, or grief, or the exhaustion of being judged by the shape of his skin. "He doesn't look much like a threat," the quiet man murmured. Virgil snorted. "Give him a rifle, see how fast that changes." Tayan said nothing. Bonnie stepped closer to him, placing herself between the fire and the men. Not with drama, just with choice. Kane rubbed his beard. "Here's what we'll do," he said finally. "We don't want blood. No need for more war. But we can't just let him go. Not after what's happened in these parts. It'd break the town in 2. Bonnie's jaw tightened. "So what do you want?" Kane looked at her like the answer was simple. "You're a widow. He's in your home. You saved his life. You're all the family he's got in this county. So make it legal." She blinked. "Legal?" "A marriage," Kane said. "Paper makes things cleaner. If he's your husband, he's one of us. That's how we keep the peace." Virgil laughed, a sharp, mean sound. "That's rich. Make her marry the savage." Kane shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The room turned colder. Bonnie looked at Tayan. His face had not changed, but something in him had gone very still. He was hearing the words, understanding enough. She whispered, "They'll kill you if I say no." He nodded once. Not to agree. To accept. She looked back at Kane. "You can draw up the papers." The next 2 hours passed like days. They brought the town clerk. They brought a preacher. They did not bring celebration, nor smiles. Just ink and obligation and a room full of eyes that did not see them, only what they wanted to believe. The wedding was performed in the cabin. Bonnie wore her boots, the hem of her dress smudged with ash. Tayan wore the same clothes he had almost died in. There were no vows, no exchange of rings. Just signatures. The clerk scrawled their names, misspelling Tayan's with something closer to Thomas, and no one corrected it. When the preacher said, "Amen," Bonnie didn't feel married. She felt claimed. She felt like land, like cattle, like something bartered. Tayan stood beside her, a statue carved from dignity and silence. Cain clapped him on the shoulder. "Welcome to Pine Hollow." Then they left. All of them. The door shut with a finality that echoed too loud. For a long while, neither of them moved. Bonnie finally turned to him. "I didn't want that," she said softly. "I wanted you to live." He nodded, then sat by the fire. The carving knife returned to his hand. His fingers worked wood into shape. She watched him, the way his shoulders curved inward slightly, as if the weight of survival was heavier than death had been. The sun had dipped low. The cabin, quiet again, now held a different silence, thicker, more complicated. Not peace. Not even truce. Just endurance. She sat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap. The paper with their names on it sat on the table like a verdict. But she did not look at it. She looked at Tayan. He looked back. And for the first time, she saw something not just behind his eyes, but rising toward them. Not gratitude. Not warmth. Something harder. Like resolve. Bonnie reached forward and picked up the carved bird he'd been working on. The wings were just beginning to take shape. "Finish it," she said. He took it from her, slowly. Outside, the wind began to shift. The storm that had loomed for weeks was moving off. But the sky remained gray. Inside, they stayed seated, still as the mountains, waiting for the next truth to come. The papers made it real for the town, but not for them. Inside the cabin, where the fire still whispered and snow still held to the windows like lace, nothing had shifted except the weight of what had been taken from choice and turned into decree. Tayan moved through the cabin with the same silence he always had. His hands still worked wood, still mended the firewood pile without being asked. He still fetched water before dawn and left it by the hearth. But now, something in him moved a beat slower, as if the air itself had grown heavier, the walls too narrow. Bonnie felt it too, though she kept her chin high and her voice measured. She made their meals, swept the floors, tended the animals, and kept the silence between them from turning brittle. The strange thing was, she didn't feel anger. Not at Tayan, not even at the men who forced their names together with ink and suspicion. What she felt was stranger than anger. It was hunger. A hunger to know who he was beyond what they'd made him. One morning, before the fire caught, she found him sitting outside on the steps, his breath rising in clouds. The snow had melted just enough to reveal patches of brown earth beneath the pines. He didn't turn when she stepped beside him, didn't speak, but she could feel the shape of his thoughts in the cold. "Do you want to leave?" she asked softly. His gaze didn't shift. Yes. There was no apology in it. No shame. Just truth. She nodded. "I wouldn't stop you. I know." They sat like that a long time, shoulders not touching but near. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out once, then vanished into the sky. He rose then, slow, and went inside. She stayed. That day she stitched new linings into their coats. His was worn thin under the arms. Her fingers moved with care, remembering the way her mother used to repair things. Quietly, without mention, as if the work of keeping things together was the closest thing to love they ever dared speak aloud. The next night, Tayan left the bird carving by her place at the table. It was finished now. Wings spread, body poised in flight. She picked it up, traced the grain with her thumb, and then looked across at him. "Did it mean something?" she asked. He studied her for a long moment. Then, "Yes." She waited. He hesitated, then answered with effort. "In my people's stories, birds carry messages. Between worlds. Is this a message?" "Yes." Her voice dropped. "What does it say?" His eyes softened. "That I stayed." She held the carving closer and nodded once. It was more than a thank you. More than a gift. It was a memory carved into shape. A quiet proof that he had once chosen to remain, even before the town had forced the word husband onto him. They began to speak more after that. Not often. Not fluently, but in short, deliberate exchanges. Words he had learned over weeks of listening began to find their way out, shaped by his accent, his cadence. Her words, slower now, met him in the middle. Neither of them filled the air with sound just to claim it. Every word they gave each other was a stone placed in a bridge. She learned that his name was not Thomas, as the papers claimed. His name was Tayan, which meant new moon, though he said it without flourish, without pride. "My mother gave it," he said one evening. What was she like? He was quiet a long time. Then, strong. She did not bow. Bonnie nodded. "I'd have liked her. She would not like this," he said, gesturing faintly to the paper pinned above the hearth. "I don't like it either," she admitted. He looked at her then, not with the guarded distance he'd held since the beginning, but with something closer to regard. They began to share more than work after that. He helped her fix the chicken coop. She showed him how to brew pine tea the way her grandmother taught her, letting the needles steep long enough to stain the water amber. He drew maps in the dirt outside, places she'd never heard of, places that lived in the landscape of his memory. He pointed once to the mountains far off. "My people walked there, before the soldiers came." Bonnie didn't ask which soldiers. She already knew. "They burned our homes," he said simply. "We buried our names in the snow." She couldn't speak for a moment. Her fingers closed around the wooden bird in her pocket. "I'm sorry," she said at last. He looked at her, and something passed through his face, soft, like wind. "You didn't hold the torch." "No," she whispered. "But I live in the house it lit." Tayan didn't answer, but he didn't look away. In the weeks that followed, a kind of tenderness bloomed, not fast, not bright, but persistent. Like moss in shadow. They moved around each other with less distance, sometimes brushing past in the kitchen, or handing tools back and forth without thinking. One morning she found him humming low as he chopped wood. It wasn't a song she knew, but it calmed her. She began to hum it later when she washed dishes. He noticed, smiled faintly, but said nothing. The town kept its distance, but not its whispers. Supplies came with tight-lipped glances. The preacher's wife no longer waved. Bonnie didn't mind. The weight of their disapproval was less than the weight of pretending. One market day, she rode into town alone. The clerk gave her change without meeting her eyes. A boy spit near her boots and muttered something cruel. She didn't flinch. On the way home, she passed the creek where she and her husband used to fish in silence. The water still moved, still laughed over stones. She realized she hadn't thought of her husband in days. Not with sorrow. Not with love. Just silence. Back at the cabin, Tayan had made stew. The scent greeted her like memory. He had even split the last of the dried herbs into the pot. She sat beside him and ate without speaking. When the bowl was empty, she said, "Thank you." He nodded. "You came back. I said I would. I know." She reached across the table, laid her fingers over his, not fully grasping, just touching. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" she asked. His thumb moved slightly beneath hers. "Sometimes." She waited. But not every day. That night, as the fire cracked and the snow fell gently, Bonnie reached for his hand again. This time, he held it. Neither of them moved beyond that. No kiss. No Debonnaetions. Just hands clasped, warm in the hush. A week later, they were building the fence together. The posts had rotted and leaned like weary men. She held them straight as he hammered. At one point, she lost balance and fell into him. He caught her. Their eyes met, close enough to feel each other's breath. He did not kiss her. But he didn't move away. They finished the fence in silence. That evening, she found an old tin box and filled it with seeds, one she'd been saving for spring, even though she hadn't planned to plant them. She handed the box to Tayan. "For the garden," she said. He opened it, sifted through the seeds with care. "You believe we'll still be here?" She thought for a long time. Then, "I believe I want to be." He closed the box and nodded. Then we plant. There were nights when they still said nothing. But the silence no longer felt empty. It was a shared quilt, wrapped around what could not be spoken and didn't need to be. One such night, she sat with a letter in her lap. It was from her sister, full of concern and questions and quiet condescension. Bonnie read it aloud in pieces. She says I should come live with her. That I've lost my way. Tayan was stirring the fire. He didn't look up. Have you? She folded the letter. No. I finally found it. He met her gaze and said, Then burn it. She did. In the final weeks of winter, something changed again. Not between them, but around them. The woods grew restless. Tayan watched the tree lean longer each day. One evening he stood outside long after the light had gone, listening. When he came in, Bonnie saw the tension in his shoulders. She didn't ask. That night, he said quietly, There's talk among the pines. I feel it. She placed her hand over his. If it comes, we'll face it. He didn't argue. In the cabin, the paper with their names still hung above the hearth, but it no longer defined them. Their bond had shifted, no longer forged by fear or decree, but chosen in hours and work and touch. They had not spoken of love. Not yet. But something deeper had rooted itself, something gentler than passion and stronger than names. And though neither of them could say what the spring would bring, they both planted the garden. Together. Without a word. The wind had changed again. It came down from the north like a breath held too long, dry and sharp and tasting faintly of smoke. Not the kind that rose gently from homestead chimneys, but the harsh, bitter scent of something distant and burning. Tayan smelled it before Bonnie did. He stood in the doorway at dawn, bare feet pressed against the old pine floor, and did not speak. The horizon was still quiet, the sky the color of old iron. But something in the trees had gone silent, and it was not the silence of peace. It was the pause before a reckoning. Bonnie came behind him, still tying her shawl. She followed his gaze and knew without asking. The fire they'd kept carefully at bay was drawing close, not flames in the trees, but in the eyes of the men who had decided once more that fear was easier to carry than understanding. That afternoon, a rider passed the cabin without slowing. No wave. No words. Just a hard look and a faster pace when Tayan stepped into view. Bonnie recognized the man. He worked for the town store, the same one who had refused to sell her thread the week before unless she paid in coin, not eggs. She watched him disappear between the trees and knew it wouldn't be long now. Tayan didn't speak of it. He returned to the garden, checking the tender shoots they'd planted just weeks before. Their roots were shallow still. He brushed dirt from a stalk and looked at it the way one might look at a child's first drawing. Proud, worried, already bracing for the wind that might come to tear it loose. Bonnie joined him, kneeling beside the small patch of hope. We'll lose them, she said. He didn't ask what she meant, whether the seedlings or something more. He only said, Not yet. That night, they didn't light the lantern. They sat in near darkness, the fire banked low. The carved bird rested on the mantel, watching them. Tayan's hands were steady around his cup, but Bonnie could see the storm behind his eyes. He was thinking of his people, of the friends who had not returned from the woods, of the ones whose names were never written down because paper refused to hold them. She saw him weighing the balance between staying and leaving, between surviving and being free. You don't have to stay, she said, the words brittle in her mouth. Not for me. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the pouch he kept tucked behind the stacked firewood. From it, he drew something small, wrapped in soft leather. He placed it on the table between them. Inside was a necklace, strung with smooth bone beads, dyed cords, and a single carved stone, green and veined like moss. My sister made it, he said. Before we were scattered. Bonnie touched it, careful not to displace its shape. It's beautiful. She wore it when she ran. Bonnie looked up. Did she make it far? No. The silence held. She'd like you, he added, voice low. Tears stung her eyes, sudden and fierce. You don't know that. I do, he said. She saw people, not fences. The next morning, The smoke was visible, a thin line of it against the pale blue sky, rising from the pines north of the ridge. Tayan watched it without blinking. Bonnie felt it in her stomach first, a coiling dread that wrapped itself tight. It wasn't just a fire. It was a signal. Someone had set it, not to burn, but to draw others in. By midday, the tracks began to appear. Hoofprints in the thawing mud, wide boots in the snow-melted brush. She saw them when she went to check the trap lines. Fresh, deliberate. Tayan met her halfway back, his bow in hand. Not raised, not drawn, just held like something remembered rather than wielded. They spoke without speaking. Bonnie packed what little she needed. A flask, dried meat, a few books. Tayan packed nothing. He'd never claimed any part of the cabin as his. He looked at it now the way a man might look at a place he'd already buried. "I want to burn it," he said quietly that evening. Bonnie didn't flinch. "Then we burn it. But not because we're afraid," he said. "No," she agreed. "Because it's time." They waited until dusk. Tayan lit the fire from inside, starting at the hearth. It was slow to catch, reluctant almost. The old wood creaked and hissed as it began to accept its fate. Bonnie stood outside, holding the carved bird. She did not cry. Not this time. As the flames climbed, she watched the smoke twist into the branches. It was not the smoke of anger or destruction. It was a funeral pyre. For who they had been. For the place that had once been shelter and prison both. Tayan stood beside her, his face lit orange and gold. She reached for his hand. He took it. "We'll go south," she said. He nodded. They rode out before the roof fell, taking the old trail past the dried creek bed. The moon was high and bright, the trees silver in its glow. They did not look back. But the world wasn't ready to let them leave quietly. Just past the ridge, where the land dropped into the low scrub and the air smelled of cedar, the ambush came. 3 riders, guns drawn, shouting, "Stop there!" Bonnie felt her body seize, her heart crack open. Tayan pulled the horse up short. He dismounted slowly, arms raised. The leader, a man she didn't know, but who wore the same badge Kane once had, pointed a rifle at Tayan's chest. "You're harboring a fugitive." Bonnie dismounted too, stepping forward. "He's not a fugitive. He's Apache. And he's my husband." That gave them pause, but not enough. "He's under suspicion for an attack on a supply train. Witnesses claim they saw him." "That's not possible," Bonnie said, voice flat. "He's been with me." One of the men laughed. "That's what you'd say, isn't it?" Tayan said nothing. Then, suddenly, he stepped forward, out of reach of her grasp. "Let her go," he said. "You don't speak for her," the leader snapped. "I speak to protect her," Tayan said. "You want blood. I'm giving you a target, not her." "No," Bonnie said, stepping beside him. "We stand together." The leader lifted his rifle. It happened fast, too fast to stop. A shot, then another. But not at Tayan. Bonnie stumbled. For a second, everything was still. Then Tayan caught her in his arms, lowering her gently to the ground. Her side was wet. Not fatal, but bleeding fast. She blinked up at him, dazed. "I'm all right," she whispered. "Stay." The men were shouting now, arguing. One of them had fired without command. Tayan rose slowly, cradling her head in the crook of his coat, then turned to face them. "She is not your enemy," he said. "Neither am I." He lifted his hands again. The tension in the clearing cracked open. The second rider, younger, dismounted. He stepped forward, rifle lowered. "This ain't justice," he said. "She's bleeding. This ain't right." The leader hesitated. The spell broke. "We're done here," the young man said. The others, unsure now, followed him back. They left. Just like that. Tayan fell to his knees beside Bonnie, tore strips from his cloak, pressed them to the wound. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I did." Later, she would not remember the ride south, only the warmth of his arms, the murmur of his voice, the steadiness of his breath. They found shelter in a hidden hollow, where the wind spoke a different language and no one looked for names. Tayan cared for her there, building fires from damp wood, boiling roots, changing her dressings. She healed. In time, she walked again. In time, they planted seeds in soil that had never known violence. They lived without names, without papers, without the weight of any past but their own choosing. Some nights, they sat by the fire and spoke softly of things once feared. Bonnie would trace the scar by her ribs and say, "It was worth it." Tayan would place her hand over his heart and say, "So was you." And if travelers passed through, they never asked questions. But some, those with eyes shaped by sorrow, would pause and listen to the wind in the trees. They'd hear the fire crackle. They'd notice the carved bird hanging above the hearth. And they'd know. They'd know that somewhere out in the wide and wild West, two souls had once refused to be separated. Not by bullets, not by borders, not even by silence. And that they had chosen each other again and again, until the world ran out of reasons to say no.